The bullet whizzed past Julia Porter's ear, close enough that she felt the heat of it as she ducked behind the overturned stagecoach. The year was 1879, and what should have been a routine journey from Laramie to Cheyenne in the Wyoming Territory had turned into a nightmare when the Blackwell Gang ambushed their coach in a narrow canyon. "Nobody needs to die today," shouted a gruff voice from the rocks above. "We just want the gold shipment and the pretty lady." Julia's heart hammered against her ribs. At 22, she was traveling alone to meet her uncle in Cheyenne after the death of her parents. The meager inheritance in her satchel was all she had left in the world. The driver lay dead, and the other two passengers' elderly brothers returning from a mining venture cowered beside her, their faces pale with terror. "You have until the count of 10 to send out the lady and the gold," the outlaw leader called, "or we start picking you off one by one." "We can't just give you up, miss," whispered one of the brothers, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Julia closed her eyes. She had survived too much to die here in this God-forsaken canyon. "Perhaps I can reason with them," she said, though she knew reasoning with outlaws was as futile as trying to reason with a rattlesnake. 1, 2, the counting began. The pounding of hooves interrupted the count. Julia peered around the edge of the stagecoach to see a lone rider galloping toward them, dust billowing behind him. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, and even from a distance, she could see the determination in his posture. 3, 4, the rider drew closer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a tan Stetson pulled low over his eyes. A Winchester rifle was clutched in one hand, his other hand expertly guiding his horse. 5, 6, hold your count, Maddox. The rider shouted, pulling his horse to a sliding stop between the stagecoach and the rocks where the outlaws were positioned. "I'm coming up," to Julia's astonishment. The counting stopped. The outlaws must know this man. The rider dismounted, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed. As he turned toward the stagecoach, Julia caught her first clear look at his face, strong jaw dusted with stubble, piercing blue eyes that held a mixture of determination and something else she couldn't quite name. "You folks stay put," he said in a low voice. "Name's Vaughn Forrester. I'm going to try to handle this." Without waiting for a response, he began climbing the rocky slope toward the outlaw's position. Julia watched, mesmerized by his confident movements, wondering if she was witnessing bravery or foolishness. "Well, look who it is," came the voice from above. "Forrester, thought you'd gone straight." Vaughn reached a plateau where 5 men waited with guns drawn. Their leader, a burly man with a scarred face, stepped forward. "I have, Maddox," Vaughn replied evenly. "Working my own spread now, north of Laramie." "Then what brings you to interfere with our business?" Maddox gestured toward the stagecoach. "Heard about your plan at the saloon in Cedar Ridge. Figured I'd try to avoid unnecessary bloodshed." Vaughn's voice remained calm, conversational even, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a robbery. "You always were soft," Maddox spat. "We want the gold shipment and we want the woman. Rumor has it she's carrying a fortune in family jewels." Julia's fingers instinctively tightened around her satchel. How did they know? "The shipment's not on this coach," Vaughn said. "Wells Fargo changed the schedule. This is just a passenger run." Maddox's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And the woman?" Vaughn shrugged. "Just a girl heading to Cheyenne from what I gathered. Nothing special." "You're lying," Maddox snarled. "My information's good. There's gold on that coach, and that woman's worth plenty." Julia watched the exchange with growing dread. How could this stranger, this Vaughn Forrester, possibly know what was on the coach, and why was he trying to protect them? "Look," Vaughn said, lowering his voice, "I've got 300 in gold eagles in my saddlebags. Take it and ride on. No need for more killing today." Maddox laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the canyon. 300. The woman alone is worth 10 times that. I've got a claim north of here," Vaughn continued. "Papers are in my pocket. It's yielding 50 ounces a week. I'll sign it over right here," Julia gasped. This man was offering his own gold mine to save strangers. Maddox appeared to consider this, greed battling with suspicion in his eyes. "Show me the papers." Vaughn slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. Maddox snatched it, eyes scanning the official-looking paper. "Looks legitimate," he admitted grudgingly. But how do I know it's really producing? Words all over Laramie about my strike, Vaughn said. Ask anyone. I wouldn't be offering if it wasn't worth it. A tense silence followed as Maddox conferred with his men in hushed tones. Julia held her breath, her future hanging in the balance of this strange negotiation. Finally, Maddox turned back to Vaughn. We'll take the claim and the 300, but we still want to see what's in that woman's satchel. Vaughn's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The claim and the money buy everyone's safety, that's the deal. You don't call the shots here, Forrester, Maddox barked, raising his gun. I want to see what she's carrying. Take mine instead, Vaughn said firmly, stepping forward. My life for hers, my gold for hers. You know I'm good for it. Julia couldn't believe what she was hearing. This stranger was offering everything he had possibly, even his life, for her safety. Maddox stared at Vaughn for a long moment, then let out a harsh laugh. You always were a fool for a pretty face, Forrester. Even back when you rode with us. Julia's eyes widened at this revelation. This man had once been an outlaw himself. Times change, Maddox. People change, Vaughn replied quietly. Another tense conference among the outlaws, and then Maddox nodded. Fine. The claim, the 300, and you ride with us to verify the mine. If you're lying, we come back for the girl. Agreed, Vaughn said without hesitation. Let me tell them they're safe and I'll go with you. Maddox nodded reluctantly, and Vaughn made his way back down to the stagecoach. As he approached, Julia stepped out from behind their cover. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vaughn's blue eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a connection she couldn't explain. Because it's right, he said simply. Then, louder for the others to hear. You'll be safe now. They're taking me to verify some information, then they'll be gone. The town of Broken Rock is about 5 miles east. You should be able to walk it before nightfall. But you're mine, Julia began. Is a fair price for 3 lives, he finished. He turned to the elderly brothers. Get her safely to Broken Rock, gentlemen. Before anyone could say another word, Vaughn returned to his horse, retrieved the saddlebags, and rejoined the outlaws. Minutes later, they disappeared over the ridge, taking with them everything this mysterious man owned. The brothers wasted no time. We should start walking, miss. It'll be dark in a few hours. Julia nodded, still stunned by what had transpired. As they began their trek toward Broken Rock, she couldn't stop thinking about Vaughn Forrester, the outlaw-turned-rancher who had just sacrificed everything for strangers. They reached Broken Rock just as the sun was setting, a small mining settlement with a single street lined with basic establishments, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, and what passed for a hotel. The town sheriff, a weathered man named Davis, listened to their story with grave concern. Sounds like you encountered the Blackwell Gang, he said, stroking his gray mustache. They've been terrorizing these parts for months, but this fella who helped you, Forrester, you say, name rings a bell. He said he had a ranch north of Laramie, Julia offered, hoping for more information about her mysterious savior. Sheriff Davis's eyes lit with recognition. Vaughn Forrester used to ride with outlaws some years back, then disappeared. Word as he struck gold went legitimate. Keeps to himself mostly, he frowned. If the Blackwell Gang has him, there's no telling what they might do, especially if his mine isn't what they hoped. We have to help him, Julia said firmly. He sacrificed everything for us. The sheriff gave her a pitying look. Miss, that's not how things work out here. I've got 1 deputy, and we can't go chasing after the Blackwell Gang. They've got at least 5 men, probably more. Then I'll go myself, Julia declared, surprising even herself with her determination. That would be suicide, miss, the sheriff replied. Best thing you can do is continue to Cheyenne as planned. I'll send word to the territorial marshals about Forrester's situation. Julia knew he was right, but something inside her couldn't accept it. This man, this stranger, had given everything to save her. How could she simply continue on her journey as if nothing had happened? That night in the small hotel room, Julia made her decision. In her satchel, besides the modest inheritance from her parents, was a gold locket containing a small but flawless diamond, a family heirloom passed down through generations. It was worth far more than the rest of her inheritance combined. At dawn, she visited the local livery stable and used part of her money to purchase a sturdy mare and supplies. When the stable master asked where a young woman alone was heading, she simply said, "To repay a debt." Tracking the Blackwell Gang would be nearly impossible for her, but she knew their destination, Vaughn's mine north of Laramie. With directions from the stable master, she set out, her determination outweighing her fear. 3 days of hard riding brought her to Laramie. There, she asked discreetly about Vaughn Forrester's claim. Most people were tight-lipped, suspicious of a young woman asking about a gold mine, but a grizzled old prospector finally gave her directions after she shared a sanitized version of her story. "Forrester's a good man," the old-timer told her, "reformed himself proper. His claims up in the foothills north of here follows Coyote Creek about 10 miles up. Cabin sits in a grove of aspens, can't miss it." He peered at her curiously. "But miss, if the Blackwell Gang's there, you'd be riding into certain danger." "I'll be careful," she promised, though she had no real plan beyond finding Vaughn. The next day, Julia approached Coyote Creek, following it upstream into increasingly rugged terrain. By mid-afternoon, she spotted a thin column of smoke rising above the trees ahead. Tethering her horse in a thicket, she proceeded on foot, moving cautiously through the underbrush. The cabin came into view, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. Outside, 2 men from the gang lounged by a fire pit, rifles across their laps. Of Vaughn or the other outlaws, there was no sign. Julia crept closer, trying to formulate a plan. Just then, the cabin door swung open, and Maddox emerged, followed by 2 more outlaws dragging Vaughn between them. His face was bruised, and he moved with the stiffness of a man who had been beaten, still claiming the mine's dried up. Maddox growled, shoving Vaughn toward the creek. "We've been digging for 2 days and found nothing but dust." "I told you," Vaughn replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "The main vein is downstream, beneath that limestone outcropping. I showed you the maps." "And I think you're stalling," Maddox spat. "One more day, Forrester, then we start taking pieces of you until you tell us the truth." Julia's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She had to do something, but what could one woman do against 5 armed outlaws? She retreated to her horse, mind racing. The solution came to her as she remembered the small town she'd passed through on her way here, Elk Valley. Just a few hours' ride away, by nightfall, Julia had reached Elk Valley and found its small sheriff's office. The young deputy on duty was skeptical of her story until she showed him the diamond from her locket. "I'll pay this to whoever helps rescue Vaughn Forrester from the Blackwell Gang," she declared. Word spread quickly in the small community. By morning, the sheriff had assembled a posse of 7 men, former soldiers, miners, and ranchers, all drawn by the promise of reward and the chance to bring down notorious outlaws. "We'll need a distraction," the sheriff explained as they rode toward Vaughn's claim. "Something to draw their attention while we get into position." "I can be the distraction," Julia volunteered, explaining her idea. The men were reluctant, but eventually agreed it was their best chance. As dusk fell, Julia approached the cabin openly, riding slowly up the trail as if she were merely lost. The 2 guards spotted her immediately, raising their rifles. "Who goes there?" one called. "Please help," Julia called back, infusing her voice with desperation. "My wagon broke down a mile back, and I've been walking for hours." The men exchanged glances, suspicious but intrigued by the appearance of a lone woman. "Stay where you are," one ordered while the other disappeared into the cabin. Moments later, Maddox emerged, followed by the rest of the gang and Vaughn, whose eyes widened in shock when he recognized Julia. "Well, what have we here?" Maddox said, approaching Julia with a predatory smile. "Seems like our lucky day, boys." "I just need help," Julia said, playing the role of the distressed traveler. "My wagon, save it, sweetheart," Maddox cut her off. "I know exactly who you are, the woman from the stagecoach." He turned to Vaughn with a cruel laugh. "Looks like your sacrifice was for nothing, Forrester." "The lady came looking for you." Vaughn's face paled. "Julia, run," he shouted, only to be silenced by a blow to his midsection. That was the signal. Gunfire erupted from the surrounding woods as the posse opened fire. Maddox and his men scrambled for cover, caught completely by surprise. In the chaos, Julia dismounted and ran toward Vaughn, who was still doubled over from the blow. "Come on," she urged, helping him to his feet. They staggered toward the tree line as bullets flew around them. The gunfight was brief but intense. When it ended, 2 of the outlaws lay dead and another was wounded. Maddox and the remaining gang member had fled into the woods, pursued by half the posse. "Are you all right?" Julia asked Vaughn once they were safely behind the sheriff's line. He stared at her in disbelief. "Why did you come back?" "How did you find me? You gave everything to save my life," she replied simply. "I couldn't just leave you to die." Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, surprise giving way to something deeper, more profound. Before he could respond, the sheriff approached. "Maddox and one of his men escaped," he reported. "But we got the others. The mine secure, Forrester," Vaughn nodded. "Yes, though there's not much left to secure. The main vein dried up weeks ago. I was about to sell the claim when all this happened." Julia's heart sank. "The mine is worthless." "But you traded it for our lives." A hint of a smile touched Vaughn's battered face. "Not worthless. Just not the bonanza they were expecting. There's still enough gold to make it a fair trade for 3 lives." Once the wounded outlaw was secured and the dead were dealt with, the posse prepared to return to Elk Valley. Julia fulfilled her promise, giving the diamond to the sheriff to divide among the men who had risked their lives. "You're welcome to stay at my cabin tonight," Vaughn told Julia as they watched the posse depart. "It's not much, but it's shelter. I can take you to Laramie tomorrow." Julia hesitated only briefly before accepting. As they walked back to the cabin, Vaughn asked the question that had clearly been puzzling him. "How did you convince those men to help you?" "I offered them my mother's diamond," she admitted. "It was worth far more than what you gave up for us." Vaughn stopped walking and turned to face her. "You gave up a family heirloom for a stranger." "You weren't a stranger anymore," Julia said softly. "Not after what you did." That night, as they sat before the fire in Vaughn's cabin, he told her his story, how he had fallen in with the wrong crowd as a young man, ridden with outlaws for 2 years, then had a change of heart after witnessing a particularly brutal robbery. He disappeared, worked honest jobs, eventually struck gold and built a new life for himself. "What about you?" he asked. "What's waiting for you in Cheyenne?" Julia told him about losing her parents to influenza, how her only remaining family was an uncle she barely knew. "I was going to use my inheritance to open a small millinery shop," she explained. "It's what my mother always wanted for me. And now," she looked down at her hands, "now I'm not sure. I used most of my money to get here and I gave away the diamond." Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. "You know, this land is still mine. The mine may be nearly dry, but the ranch is good. Plenty of water, good grazing." He cleared his throat. "A man could build a good life here. A family could thrive." Their eyes met across the fire, and Julia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "Are you proposing something, Mr. Forrester?" she asked, her heart beating faster. "Maybe I am," he replied, a smile breaking through his bruised features. "Not marriage, not yet. That would be too forward, but maybe a partnership to start. This place could use a woman's touch, and I could use a partner." "A business arrangement?" Julia asked, raising an eyebrow. "For now," Vaughn said. "Though I admit, Miss Porter, I find myself unusually drawn to a woman who would risk everything to save a former outlaw she barely knows." Julia laughed, the sound bright in the quiet cabin. "And I find myself unusually drawn to a man who would give up everything to save a woman he'd never met." As spring turned to summer, Julia and Vaughn worked side by side to transform the mining claim into a proper ranch. Word spread about how they'd stood against the Blackwell Gang, and neighboring ranchers came to offer help and welcome them to the community. Julia wrote to her uncle in Cheyenne, explaining her change in plans, and received his blessing along with a small additional inheritance that helped establish their operation. Maddox was eventually captured by marshals near the Montana border, bringing closure to their ordeal. With that shadow lifted, Vaughn and Julia's partnership flourished, their initial attraction deepening into something more profound. On a warm evening in August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Vaughn took Julia's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "about our partnership." Oh, Julia replied, sensing the importance of the moment. It's been the best few months of my life, Vaughn continued, but I find myself wanting more than a business arrangement. Julia's heart quickened. What did you have in mind, Mr. Forrester? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rough-hewn wooden box. Inside was a ring not fancy or elaborate, but beautiful in its simplicity. A small gold band with a tiny fleck of gold still in its natural form. I panned this gold myself from the last bit of the stream, he explained. Had it made in Laramie last week. It's beautiful, Julia whispered. Julia Porter, Vaughn said, taking both her hands in his. When I offered my gold for your life that day, I had no idea I was really saving my own future. Will you marry me? Tears filled Julia's eyes as she nodded. Yes, Vaughn Forrester, I will. They were married in Laramie that autumn, with half the county in attendance. The former outlaw and the courageous young woman who had risked everything to save him had become something of a legend in the territory. As they drove back to their ranch after the ceremony, Vaughn took his wife's hand. I never believed in second chances until you came along, he said. You gave me more than my life back, you gave me a reason to live it well. Julia squeezed his hand, and you showed me that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Years passed, and the Forrester ranch prospered. They had 3 children who grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though certain details were softened until they were older. The gold mine that had been nearly worthless eventually revealed a new vein, providing enough to expand their holdings and establish a comfortable life. On their 20th anniversary, Vaughn presented Julia with a locket to replace the one she had sacrificed. Inside was not a diamond, but a tiny nugget of gold from their mine. Not nearly as valuable as what you gave up, he acknowledged, but it represents everything we've built together. It's perfect, Julia assured him, thinking back to that day when Outlaws had demanded gold for her life, and a cowboy had said, take mine instead. In the end, they had both given up treasures, only to find something far more valuable. A love as enduring as the mountains that surrounded their home, and as genuine as the gold that had brought them together. As they stood on their porch, watching their children and grandchildren play in the yard of the home they had built together, Julia leaned into her husband's embrace, profoundly grateful for the twist of fate that had placed them both on that stagecoach road all those years ago. What had begun as a desperate sacrifice had blossomed into a lifetime of love, a treasure far more precious than all the gold in Wyoming.